For 8 years, Victoria Morgan had built her life around Ethan. Together, they owned a beauty salon in Boston, a place that had grown from a modest neighborhood shop into a fashionable destination downtown. It wasn't just their business, it was their shared dream, a symbol of everything they had achieved side by side. To their employees, the Morgans seemed like a strong couple, partners in work and in life. To Victoria, that had always been true, or at least she thought it was. That December evening, the salon hosted its holiday party in one of Boston's most elegant downtown nightclubs. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above the dance floor. Champagne glasses clinked, and laughter floated through the air. Victoria had spent the week preparing, making sure everything looked perfect. She wanted her staff to feel appreciated, to celebrate a year of hard work. She wore a simple but elegant black dress, her hair swept into a soft updo, her smile carrying the calm confidence of a woman who had grown into her role as both manager and owner. Ethan stood beside her in a tailored suit, greeting employees, shaking hands, enjoying the attention. They looked from the outside like a power couple, but illusions never last long. Victoria turned from the bar, holding 2 glasses of champagne, and froze. Just a few feet away, beneath the warm glow of the lights, Ethan was kissing one of their junior stylists. The girl couldn't have been more than 22. Her hands rested lightly on his chest, her lips pressed against his, and Ethan wasn't pushing her away. He leaned into it, smiling, careless of the dozens of eyes around them. The room seemed to go silent. Victoria's breath caught, the glasses in her hands trembling. For a moment, she couldn't move. 8 years of marriage, of trust, of building something together, shattered in a single, public kiss. Colleagues whispered behind manicured hands, a ripple of shock running through the staff. Ethan didn't even glance her way. The champagne flutes clinked together as Victoria set them down, her vision blurring. Her heart pounded, not with anger, but with a numbness so deep it felt like the ground had opened beneath her feet. Without a word, she turned and walked away. The December air outside hit her like a slap. Boston's winter night was cruel and sharp, the wind biting through her thin dress. She hadn't thought to grab her coat. Her heels clicked against the icy pavement as she stumbled toward the side alley, desperate to escape the muffled music and the humiliation still echoing inside. And then she saw him. A man lay slumped near the club service entrance, his white shirt wrinkled, his tie loosened, a smear of blood on his lower lip. 2 security guards hovered nearby, debating whether to let him sleep it off or push him onto the street. "He's breathing," one said with indifference. "Not our problem," the other replied. The man groaned, trying to sit up. His dark hair was messy, his jaw shadowed with stubble, but when his eyes flickered open for a moment, they were startlingly clear. Hazel, sharp even through the haze of alcohol. Victoria's instincts took over before she could question herself. Maybe it was the look in his eyes, mirroring the same brokenness she felt. Maybe it was the reckless urge to do something, anything, that might distract her from the betrayal still burning in her chest. "He's with me," she heard herself say, stepping forward. The guards exchanged skeptical glances, but didn't argue. The man tried to stand, swaying. Victoria slipped an arm under his, steadying him. He looked down at her with confusion and a faint, hoarse whisper. "Why?" "Don't talk," she murmured. "Just walk." They moved slowly toward the street. A taxi pulled up, its headlights slicing through the cold night. Victoria gave the driver an address she didn't recognize. The man's voice had managed to form a street name, somewhere in a quieter part of the city. The ride was silent. He leaned against the window, his breath fogging the glass, while Victoria sat rigid, staring straight ahead. Her pulse hadn't slowed since the moment she'd seen Ethan with that girl. Now, instead of anger, she felt an odd, reckless calm. She had no idea who this stranger was, or why she was helping him. All she knew was that she couldn't go back inside that club, couldn't face the lies, the whispers, the false smile Ethan would surely wear if she did. When the cab pulled up to an old brick building on a quiet street, Victoria paid the driver and guided the man inside. His apartment was small, but surprisingly tidy. Books stacked neatly on shelves, the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air. For a moment, Victoria simply stood there, not sure what she was doing. The man, Gabriel Reed, though she didn't know his name yet, looked at her with a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. His voice, rough from drink and pain, broke the silence. "Thank you." Victoria didn't reply. She wasn't ready to speak, not after what she had witnessed that night. She only nodded, her hand still gripping the strap of her purse as if it were the only solid thing in her world. Somewhere back at the nightclub, Ethan was probably laughing, drinking, pretending nothing had happened. But here, in this quiet apartment with a stranger barely able to stand, Victoria felt the first flicker of something unexpected. Not relief, not hope, but a step away from the life she thought she knew. And she didn't look back. Gabriel's apartment was nothing like what Victoria expected. She had braced herself for chaos. Empty bottles scattered across the floor, clothes tossed in piles, the stale odor of alcohol. Instead, when she helped him inside, she found herself standing in a space that was small but meticulously kept. The living room was lined with bookshelves, medical journals stacked neatly on the coffee table. A clean kitchen gleamed under the fluorescent light, and the faint scent of soap lingered in the air. It was disorienting. A man she had just seen collapsed outside a nightclub lived here in order, in discipline. She felt like an intruder. Yet Gabriel moved through the apartment as if he belonged to it completely, even in his unsteady state. He disappeared into the bathroom, the sound of running water filling the silence, while Victoria stood in the middle of the living room, clutching her coat around her shoulders. She should have left. Every reasonable part of her screamed that this was madness. She had just walked away from her husband kissing another woman, and now she was in a stranger's apartment, far from home. But reason had been stripped away the moment Ethan leaned into that kiss. Her life, 8 years of loyalty, love, and labor, had been reduced to a public humiliation. When Gabriel reemerged, his hair damp, wearing simple sweatpants and a t-shirt, he looked different. Clean, younger somehow, his features softer, but his eyes clearer. He gave her a faint, almost embarrassed smile. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice low. "I must look pathetic." Victoria shook her head, though her throat felt tight. "You don't." They stood in silence, the air between them heavy with things unsaid. He didn't ask why she had helped him, and she didn't explain. It was as though both of them understood that explanations didn't matter tonight. What mattered was the ache in her chest, the hollow where trust had been ripped away, and the strange comfort of being in a place untouched by Ethan's betrayal. When she stepped closer, it wasn't deliberate. It was instinct. Gabriel didn't move away. His body radiated warmth, steady despite the lingering scent of alcohol. She reached for him, hesitant at first, then with the urgency of someone desperate to drown out pain. The kiss was soft, almost cautious, and for a moment Victoria thought he might resist. But he didn't. He let her lead, his hands uncertain but not rejecting, his lips meeting hers in a rhythm that spoke more of sorrow than passion. They moved together slowly, carefully, as though they both knew this wasn't about desire. It was about forgetting, even just for a few hours, the wounds they carried. Later, when they lay side by side, the city muffled beyond the windows, Victoria stared at the ceiling. Her mind replayed the scene at the nightclub, the stunned faces of her staff, the smirk on Ethan's lips, the sting of betrayal. She closed her eyes, pressing her hand against Gabriel's chest as if to steady herself against the weight of it all. He didn't speak. He didn't ask for promises or confessions. He simply allowed her to exist in the quiet, and that silence was its own kind of mercy. By dawn, the haze of desperation lifted. The pale Boston sunlight filtered through the blinds, revealing the stark reality of where she was and what she had done. The sound of clinking dishes came from the kitchen, And when Victoria sat up, she saw Gabriel at the counter, pouring coffee into 2 mugs, a plate of toast waiting on the table. He turned to her, a trace of warmth in his expression. "Good morning," he said gently. The kindness in his voice pierced her more than cruelty ever could. Shame surged through her chest. She rose quickly, gathering her things, avoiding his eyes. "I shouldn't have stayed," she whispered. "Wait," Gabriel said softly, stepping toward her. "At least tell me your name." Victoria hesitated at the door, her coat half on. "Victoria," she muttered, then shook her head. It was a mistake. She didn't look back as she left. The cold air outside Boston's streets hit her again, but this time it wasn't shocking. It was sobering. The night had been nothing more than a desperate grasp at relief. She repeated it to herself with every step. It was a mistake. A mistake. When she returned home, Ethan was sitting in the kitchen with a mug of coffee, scrolling through his phone as if the night before had never happened. He looked up with a smile that made her stomach turn. "There you are," he said casually. "You left the party so suddenly. Everyone asked about you." Victoria stood in the doorway, staring at him. His tone was light, his eyes calm, as if he hadn't kissed another woman in front of half their employees. He sipped his coffee, pretending nothing had happened. And in that moment, she realized something even more devastating than the betrayal itself. Ethan would never acknowledge it. He would bury it, smile through it, and expect her to do the same. Victoria felt her skin crawl. The walls of the house that once symbolized partnership now felt like a prison. And as Ethan set down his mug, humming to himself, she knew, no matter how she tried to convince herself otherwise, life with him would never be the same again. In the days that followed, Ethan transformed, or at least he tried to. He arrived home earlier than usual, carrying bouquets of roses wrapped in brown paper, their scent filling the kitchen as if flowers could erase betrayal. He booked dinner reservations at upscale restaurants near Back Bay, insisting they enjoy candlelit evenings together. He even began to talk, almost casually, about starting a family, the very conversation he had avoided for years. To anyone else, it might have seemed like a renaissance of their marriage. Neighbors would have smiled at the sight of Ethan helping Victoria into her coat, holding doors open for her, making small, affectionate gestures in public. But Victoria saw the cracks beneath the performance. She had lived with him long enough to know when his eyes darted too quickly, when his smile was just a mask. At home, Ethan's phone became an extension of his hand. He set it face down on the counter whenever she walked into the room, silenced notifications before bed, and stepped into the hallway to answer calls. Once, while they sat together on the couch, she saw the screen light up. The preview of a message glowed before he could snatch the phone away. "I miss you, Ethan. When will you talk to her?" Her stomach twisted, but she said nothing. The charade was exhausting, yet she played along, pretending not to notice, pretending she believed in the sudden flowers and rehearsed tenderness, pretending their life was untouched. But inside, guilt festered alongside revulsion. She carried a secret of her own, her night with Gabriel, a single night born of despair. Yet it sat heavy in her chest, a silent accusation she couldn't ignore. The weight of it all began to suffocate her. At the salon, she smiled at clients, directed her staff, and answered emails. But every so often she caught her reflection in the mirror. Tired eyes, lips pressed tight, a woman playing a role she no longer believed in. One crisp morning in January, the illusion shattered further. Victoria awoke nauseous, clutching her stomach as she rushed to the bathroom. She leaned over the sink, trembling. A faint dread pulsed through her veins as she counted the days she had ignored. Her cycle was late, far later than it should have been. Panic clawed at her throat. She dressed quickly, pulled a scarf around her neck, and slipped out of the apartment before Ethan had even finished his shower. She walked briskly through the biting cold to a pharmacy several blocks away, deliberately choosing one where no one might recognize her. The clerk bagged the small rectangular box without a glance, but Victoria's hands shook as she carried it home. In the bathroom, she followed the instructions with mechanical precision, setting the test on the counter and pacing, unable to breathe. When the result appeared, it was instant, two bold, unmistakable lines. Positive. She sank onto the edge of the tub, staring at the plastic stick as if it could explain itself. Her mind spiraled. The baby could be Ethan's. They had been together that week, sharing the bed as part of Ethan's sudden campaign of marital revival. But it could just as easily be Gabriel's. The timing overlapped in a cruel, mocking way that offered no certainty. Her heart pounded in her ears. The walls of the bathroom seemed to close in, the mirror reflecting a stranger's pale, stricken face. She pressed a hand to her abdomen, but felt nothing, only the enormity of what had just been thrust upon her. The nausea rose again, sharper this time, and she doubled over, gripping the sink. Tears stung her eyes. A child, conceived in the shadow of betrayal, tangled in lies and secrets. How could she possibly bring it into this world? How could she raise a baby while her marriage disintegrated and her heart carried the weight of a single reckless night? By the time Ethan came into the kitchen, freshly shaved and humming under his breath, Victoria had hidden the test deep inside her purse. He kissed her on the forehead, oblivious, talking about a client meeting scheduled for the afternoon. She nodded at all the right places, her face a mask of calm, while inside her body shook with dread. That evening, when Ethan poured wine and talked again about how the time was right for them to think about children, Victoria's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. She wanted to scream the truth at him, to throw the test on the table, to demand what kind of father he thought he could be when his loyalty was already elsewhere. But the words lodged in her throat. Instead, she smiled faintly and excused herself early, retreating to the bathroom where she sat on the cold tile floor, holding the test once more. The thought circled relentlessly. I can't do this. Not like this. By midnight, she had made a decision, or at least the beginning of one. The shame, the uncertainty, the fear of raising a child who might not even belong to Ethan. It all pointed in one direction. She would end it. Victoria whispered it into the silence, her voice shaking. I'll end it. But even as the words left her lips, her heart resisted. The appointment slip sat heavy in Victoria's purse, as though it carried the weight of her shame. She had scheduled it in a quiet voice over the phone, barely able to say the words. The woman on the other end had simply asked for the date of her last cycle, given her a time and told her to bring an ID. It all felt disturbingly routine. That morning, she wrapped a scarf tightly around her neck and walked briskly through the icy streets of Boston toward the women's health clinic. The city was waking up around her, commuters rushing to the T, steam rising from manholes. But she moved in a fog, her eyes fixed on the pavement. Each step echoed a mantra she wasn't sure she believed. It's the only way. It has to be the only way. Inside, the clinic was quiet, the walls painted a sterile shade of pale blue. Women of different ages sat scattered in the waiting area, eyes lowered to their phones, coats draped across their laps. No one spoke. Victoria checked in at the front desk and was given a clipboard, her hands trembling as she filled out the forms. When her name was called, her legs felt like lead as she followed the nurse down the narrow hallway. The nurse opened the door to a consultation room. Dr. Reed will be with you shortly, she said. Victoria stepped inside and the world stopped. Behind the desk sat Gabriel Reed, clean-shaven now, wearing a white coat over a neatly pressed shirt, his hazel eyes clear and sharp. He looked up from a patient chart, and for a brief second, surprise flickered across his face. Then his expression softened into something calm, steady, almost inevitable. Victoria, he said quietly. Her throat closed. Of all the doctors in all of Boston, it had to be him. The man she had carried home half-conscious. The man she had clung to in despair. The man who might be the father of the child she was here to end. She sank into the chair opposite him, clutching her purse like a lifeline. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the tick of a clock on the wall. Gabriel set the chart aside, his voice even but gentle. "Are you certain this is what you want?" Victoria forced herself to nod. Yes, but her voice cracked. He leaned back, studying her. "I won't try to change your mind if you're sure. But I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." Her eyes lifted, meeting his. "Are you ending this pregnancy because you don't want the child," he asked, "or because you're afraid?" The words landed like a strike. Victoria's breath caught, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. She opened her mouth, closed it again, then whispered, I don't know." Gabriel's expression softened. Fear is powerful. It convinces us we can't survive what's ahead. But you're stronger than you think. She shook her head, anger and grief tangling inside her. "You don't understand. My husband, he betrayed me. I don't even know who this child belongs to. If it's his, if it's yours," her voice broke. "I can't carry that uncertainty." Gabriel didn't flinch. He folded his hands on the desk. "Then let me tell you something about uncertainty. The night we met, I was drunker than I had ever been in my life. My father had just died after months of suffering. We held the memorial at that nightclub because it was his favorite place to dance. I drank until I collapsed. And then you appeared. You picked me up off the ground when no one else would. That night you saved me." Victoria's tears spilled over. She had never known the weight he carried that night. He leaned forward. "Now you sit here, thinking of ending a life that could be ours. I won't condemn you, but I need you to see this clearly. You're not here because you don't want a child. You're here because you're afraid of the pain, of the judgment, of being alone. Am I wrong?" The truth stung. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing quietly. "I can't do this by myself." "You won't," Gabriel said softly. "Whatever you decide, you're not alone." For the first time in weeks, a crack appeared in the armor of her despair. His words didn't erase the fear, but they lit a small flame in the darkness. The nurse knocked gently, reminding them of the time. Gabriel stood, placing the chart back on the desk. "You don't have to decide today. Take a night. If you return tomorrow and still want this, I'll proceed. But don't choose from fear. Choose from truth." Victoria rose unsteadily, clutching her purse. At the door, she paused, looking back at him. His eyes held no judgment, only quiet sadness. She walked out into the frigid Boston air, the slip of paper with her appointment still crumpled in her hand. But somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the fear, another decision had begun to take root. By the time she reached her apartment, she knew. She would not go back. She would not end it. The child would live. Victoria packed in silence. The once shared home, filled with polished hardwood floors and framed photographs of a life she thought she knew, had become unbearable. Every corner carried the echo of betrayal, the laugh Ethan had shared with that girl at the party, the lies he told with practiced ease. She moved methodically, folding clothes, sliding them into 2 suitcases, pausing only when her eyes landed on the wedding photo on the dresser. She turned the frame, face down. By dawn, she had arranged the legal paperwork. The attorney she contacted assured her the process of transferring her share of the salon could be done quickly. She would sign everything over to Ethan. The business no longer mattered. What she needed was freedom. When she left the keys and documents on the director's desk at the salon, the staff whispered among themselves, stunned by her abrupt departure. Victoria offered no explanation. She couldn't bear to recount the humiliation or the secret that now grew inside her. That evening, Ethan appeared at the door of her new apartment. He carried roses, the crimson blooms trembling slightly as he held them out. His face was painted with remorse, his voice soft, coaxing. "Victoria, please, let's talk. I know I made mistakes, but we can fix this." For a moment, she almost believed him. He had always been persuasive, always quick with charm when he needed to repair his image. But as he stepped inside, the bouquet between them, she saw the flicker of calculation in his eyes. Then she spoke, her voice steady but quiet. "I'm pregnant." The flowers sagged in his hand. He stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. At first, there was only silence, the air heavy, his jaw tightening. Then his composure cracked. His voice dropped into a low, simmering anger. "Pregnant? 8 weeks? Is it mine?" Victoria lifted her chin. "I don't know." His face twisted, the mask of remorse vanishing. "You slept with someone else." His tone was sharp, accusatory, as if her desperation, her single night of weakness, was equal to his months of betrayal. "Yes," she answered simply. "On the night of the party, when you kissed that girl in front of everyone. So this is revenge." Ethan's voice rose, echoing in the small apartment. He dropped the roses onto the floor, petals scattering across the wood like drops of blood. "You wanted to hurt me, so you went out and— This isn't revenge," Victoria cut in, her voice firm, unwavering. "This is consequence. You broke us, Ethan. You destroyed what we had. That night it was desperation. But this child, whatever happens, will not be defined by your betrayal." His chest heaved with anger. He stared at her, searching for some sign of submission, some hint that she might bend. But Victoria stood tall, her hand unconsciously brushing against her abdomen as if shielding the life inside. "You'll regret this," he spat, his voice trembling with rage. "You'll regret walking away from me." "No," she said softly. "The only regret I'd have is staying." For a long moment, the only sound was the rustle of the roses at his feet as his shoe shifted against them. Then Ethan turned sharply, storming out, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. Victoria exhaled, her body trembling, but it wasn't fear. It was release. She leaned against the door, eyes closed, tears slipping down her cheeks, not tears of despair but of relief. At last the decision was made. She had walked away. A month passed. Winter clung to Boston with its unforgiving wind, piling snow along the edges of narrow Beacon Hill streets. Victoria's apartment was small, just one bedroom with tall windows overlooking the brick facades and gas lamps outside. It was quiet, too quiet, except for the rhythmic hum of the radiator. She tried to fill the silence with work, setting up an online store from her laptop, but loneliness lingered in every corner. She hadn't seen Ethan since the night he stormed out. He had left her in anger, and she had let him go without looking back. Some nights she worried he might return, but the fear faded with each day of silence. What remained was the slow, cautious acceptance that she was truly on her own. Then, one Saturday evening, a knock sounded at her door. Victoria froze. For a moment, her heart leapt with dread, imagining Ethan's voice demanding answers. But when she opened the door, it was Gabriel. He stood there in a wool coat dusted with snow, holding a paper bag in one hand and a thermos in the other. His hazel eyes met hers with quiet steadiness. "May I come in?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then stepped aside. Gabriel walked in, placing the bag on the small kitchen table. The aroma of homemade soup filled the room as he unpacked containers, bread and fruit. Victoria watched in silence, unsure what to say. "You don't have to do this," she finally murmured. "I know," Gabriel replied simply, removing his coat. "But I want to." They ate together at the little table, not speaking much. Gabriel didn't press her with questions, didn't probe into her fears or decisions. He simply sat across from her, offering presence instead of demands. That silence, the absence of judgment, was something Victoria hadn't realized she craved until then. After dinner, he washed the dishes as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Victoria leaned against the doorway, watching him. His movements were steady, practiced. There was no urgency, no pretense. Just a man quietly making himself useful in a space that wasn't his. When he finished, he turned, drying his hands on a towel. "How have you been managing?" Victoria hesitated, then admitted, "Some days are harder than others." He nodded, not offering platitudes, not pretending to fix what couldn't be fixed. Instead, he simply said, "That's normal. You don't have to be strong all the time." Something in her chest loosened. She hadn't realized how tightly she had been holding herself together until he gave her permission to let go. That evening became the first of many. Gabriel began stopping by once or twice a week, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes just sitting with her as she worked. He never overstayed, never intruded, but he became a steady presence. Victoria found herself waiting for those evenings. It wasn't romance, there were no declarations, no stolen kisses, but it was something steadier, quieter, a companionship born not of passion, but of mutual understanding. One night, as they sat on the couch, Victoria resting with her hands folded over her stomach, she whispered, "What if this baby isn't yours?" Gabriel looked at her calmly. "Then it isn't. But if it is, we'll face that too. Either way, the child deserved a chance. And you deserve not to carry the weight alone." His words settled into her like warmth after a long chill. She turned to him, searching his face for any sign of hesitation, but found none. He wasn't offering illusions or promises of a perfect future. He was simply offering to stand beside her, however uncertain the path might be. Slowly, Victoria began to trust him, not in the way she had once trusted Ethan, blindly and completely, but in the way you trust someone who shows up consistently, who proves with actions rather than words. Weeks slipped into a rhythm. Gabriel would arrive with fresh produce from the market, set his coat neatly on the rack, and ask about her day. Sometimes they ate in silence. Sometimes they shared stories, his about long hospital shifts, hers about the challenges of starting a new business. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a sweeping love story, but for Victoria it was enough. It was the beginning of something that felt real. On a particularly cold night, as snow fell thick against the windows, Gabriel rose to leave. At the door, he paused, his gaze resting on her. "You're stronger than you know," he said softly, "but even strength needs someone to lean on. Don't forget that." When the door closed behind him, Victoria stood for a long time, her hand resting gently on her growing stomach. For the first time in months, she felt a quiet peace. Not certainty, not safety, but the assurance that she wasn't walking this road alone. By the 4th month of her pregnancy, Victoria's body had begun to change in ways she could no longer hide. Her small Beacon Hill apartment carried the quiet rhythm of a new life taking shape. The nausea had faded, replaced by a gentle swell of her belly. She spent her mornings answering emails for her fledgling online business, afternoons walking along the brick sidewalks, and evenings often shared with Gabriel. The quiet didn't last. One gray afternoon, a knock sounded at her door. When she opened it, Ethan stood there with a man in a tailored suit. The man introduced himself curtly as Ethan's attorney. Ethan pushed forward, his expression tight, his eyes hard. "We need to talk," Ethan said flatly. Victoria didn't move. Her hand instinctively pressed against her stomach, shielding the child. "About what?" "The baby," Ethan snapped. His attorney cleared his throat, pulling a folder from his briefcase. "We are requesting a paternity test," the lawyer said smoothly. "Mr. Morgan has reason to believe the child may not be his. If that's the case, he will not be held financially responsible. If it is, we'll be pursuing shared custody. Additionally, Mr. Morgan is seeking a fair division of marital assets." Victoria's pulse roared in her ears, but she held her ground. "No," she said simply. The attorney raised an eyebrow. "I'm afraid you don't have the authority to deny it. A petition can and will be filed in family court." Ethan stepped closer, his voice rising. "You think you can walk away from me, keep my business, and raise another man's kid under my name? You've lost your mind." Victoria stood in the doorway, her frame steady though her heart raced. "You forfeited the right to call yourself a husband the night you kissed another woman in front of everyone. And you forfeited the right to call yourself a father when you lied, when you chose betrayal over truth." Her words cut through the room like glass. Ethan's face flushed crimson. He took a step forward, but Victoria lifted her hand. Her palm pressed protectively against her belly, blocking his path. The gesture was instinctive, but it became more than that. It was a shield, a declaration. "This child will never be your bargaining chip," she said firmly. Behind her, Gabriel emerged from the kitchen. He had arrived earlier, bringing groceries and checking on her, and now he stepped into the doorway, his presence calm but resolute. He didn't speak at first, but his silent stance beside Victoria was unmistakable. He was there, ready to intervene if Ethan pushed further. Ethan's eyes flicked toward him, narrowing. "So this is him," he sneered. "The mystery man. The reason my wife—" "Ex-wife," Victoria interrupted sharply. Ethan's mouth snapped shut. For a moment, the room was filled only with the tense hum of confrontation. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for the raw emotion playing out before him. Gabriel's voice finally broke the silence, calm but edged with steel. "You've made your position clear. Now you need to leave. Victoria doesn't owe you anything. Not her peace, not her home, and certainly not this child." Ethan's nostrils flared. "You think you can just step in? You don't even know if it's yours." Gabriel met his glare, without flinching. "Biology doesn't make someone a father. Choices do. And from what I've seen, you've already made yours." The words landed with the finality of a verdict. Ethan's hand tightened into a fist at his side, but he didn't advance. His attorney touched his arm, urging restraint. "Mr. Morgan, this isn't the place." Victoria stood taller, her back straight, her hand still, guarding her stomach. "You can file whatever papers you want. But understand this, Ethan, I will fight you. Not out of spite, but because this child deserves safety. And that's something you can't provide." For a long moment, Ethan's rage battled with the reality of her resolve. Then, with a muttered curse, he turned on his heel, shoving past his attorney as he stormed down the hallway. The lawyer offered a stiff nod, gathered his briefcase, and followed. When the door finally clicked shut, the apartment fell into silence. Victoria's legs trembled, but she remained at the door, her hand pressed firmly against her stomach. Gabriel moved closer, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Are you all right?" She exhaled, shakily nodding. "I had to stand up to him. For the baby." Gabriel's hand lingered, his voice steady. "You did more than that. You showed him you're not afraid anymore." Her eyes lifted to his, and in that moment she realized the truth. She wasn't alone. Gabriel's presence wasn't just comfort, it was protection, a quiet strength that had begun to intertwine with her own. As the last of the winter light faded outside, Victoria stepped away from the door, her hand still cradling the curve of her belly. The confrontation had left her shaken, but it had also clarified something deep within her. This wasn't about Ethan anymore. This was about the child she carried, and the family she was beginning to build, however unconventional, with the man who chose to stand beside her. Spring had arrived in Boston, softening the bitter edge of winter. The magnolia trees bloomed along Commonwealth Avenue, their pale petals drifting through the air like confetti. In a quiet hospital room overlooking the Charles River, Victoria gripped the side rails of the bed, her face contorted with pain as another contraction tore through her. Gabriel was at her side, his hand firmly clasping hers. He leaned close, his voice steady even as sweat beaded on her brow. "Breathe with me, Victoria. And out. You're doing so well." She bore down, clutching his hand so tightly her knuckles whitened. The pain came in waves, sharp and unrelenting, but his presence anchored her. Between contractions, she caught his gaze, calm, unwavering, resolute. It was as if he was willing her to hold on, to push through the storm. Hours blurred together. Nurses moved in and out, adjusting monitors, murmuring encouragement. But Victoria's world had narrowed to two things: the child fighting its way into the world and Gabriel's hand steady in hers. Finally, with one last desperate push, the cry of a newborn filled the room. The sound cracked through the tension like sunlight breaking a storm. Victoria collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face. A nurse placed the tiny bundle in her arms, a wrinkled face, fists clenched tight, lungs announcing her arrival to the world. Victoria stared at her daughter, all flooding her chest. "Sophia," she whispered. The name had come to her in a quiet moment weeks before, its meaning, wisdom, feeling like a promise. Gabriel brushed damp hair from Victoria's forehead, his own eyes shining. "She's beautiful," he said softly, "just like her mother." Sophia's cries softened as Victoria rocked her gently. For a moment, everything was still. The hum of the monitors, the footsteps in the hallway, the muted city sounds outside. All that mattered was the fragile new life in her arms and the man who had stood beside her through every contraction. The door opened quietly. Ethan stepped inside. He carried no flowers this time, no grand gestures. Just a small box of infant clothes tucked under his arm. His face was pale, his eyes hollow as they fell on Victoria, holding Sophia. For a long moment, he didn't move. He simply stood there, staring at the child he once might have claimed without question. "May I?" he asked finally, his voice low. Victoria hesitated, then tilted the blanket back just enough for him to see. Ethan stepped closer, leaning over the hospital bed. His breath caught as he studied Sophia's tiny features, her dark lashes fluttering, her mouth opening in a soft sigh. "She looks," he began, then stopped. His voice cracked. "She looks like herself." Victoria nodded. "Yes, she does." Silence settled over them, heavy but not hostile. For a fleeting second, she almost saw the man she had once loved, the Ethan from years ago, before betrayal, before lies. But then his eyes flicked to hers, sharp with an unspoken question. "We should do a paternity test," he said quietly, "just to know." Victoria's jaw tightened. She pulled Sophia closer, her voice steady. "No, there will be no test." Ethan straightened, frowning. "Don't you want certainty?" "I already have it," Victoria replied. "This child is mine. And you." She met his gaze without flinching. "You chose someone else. Live with that." The words landed with finality, closing the last door between them. Ethan lingered for a moment longer, his face a mixture of regret and anger, then placed the box of clothes on the chair. He bent down, brushed his lips against Victoria's forehead in a gesture that felt hollow, and left the room without another word. It was the last time she ever saw him. The door clicked shut, leaving only the soft hum of machines and Sophia's quiet breaths. Gabriel returned to Victoria's side, resting his hand gently on her shoulder. "You did it," he whispered. Victoria looked down at Sophia, then up at Gabriel, her chest swelling with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. "We did it," she corrected softly. Outside the window, the sun dipped over the Charles, painting the river in gold. Inside, a new chapter had begun. The weeks after Sophia's birth blurred together in a haze of sleepless nights, quiet feedings, and the tender chaos of new motherhood. Victoria's world had narrowed to the rhythm of her daughter's cries, the softness of her tiny hands, and the fragile weight of responsibility resting on her shoulders. Yet she was not alone. Gabriel was there. He came every morning before his hospital shifts, sometimes carrying fresh bagels from a cafe down the street, sometimes just a thermos of coffee. He held Sophia so Victoria could shower, change diapers without complaint, and stayed through long evenings when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. His presence was steady, grounding. He never demanded gratitude, never asked for more than she could give. As spring gave way to summer, Gabriel made a decision of his own. With savings and a small loan, he opened a private clinic in a modest brick building near Boston's South End. It wasn't grand, just 3 examination rooms and a reception area, but it was a place where he could care for patients on his own terms. He worked long hours, yet he always returned to Victoria and Sophia, his evenings spent in the quiet glow of their apartment rather than the noise of the city. Victoria, too, began rebuilding. With the remnants of her business experience, she launched an online beauty store from home. At first, sales trickled in slowly, just a handful of orders a week. But she poured herself into it during Sophia's naps, photographing products by the window for natural light, answering customer messages with personal notes. Word spread, and by autumn her store began to grow. The hum of packing boxes replaced the silence that had once haunted her apartment. Life settled into a rhythm. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. On Saturdays, Gabriel would wheel Sophia's stroller through the cobblestone streets of Beacon Hill while Victoria walked beside him, her hand brushing against his. They weren't married, not even officially a couple, yet there was a quiet intimacy in their companionship. Sophia, as she grew, became the heart of their little household. By her first birthday, she was toddling across the living room floor, her laughter filling every corner. One afternoon, as she stumbled into Gabriel's waiting arms, the words slipped out, clear, certain. "Dad." Victoria froze, her hands halfway through folding laundry. Gabriel looked up, startled, his eyes wide. Then Sophia giggled, clinging to his leg. The word had come naturally, uncoached, as if it had always belonged to him. A lump rose in Victoria's throat. She met Gabriel's gaze, and for a moment neither spoke. But no words were needed. Sophia had named the truth they had both been living. Still, Gabriel never pressed for labels, never pushed for promises. He continued showing up, building his clinic, supporting Victoria's store, and above all, being there for Sophia. And in that quiet consistency, love took root. Not the fiery, impulsive love of her younger years, but a steady flame that promised endurance. One golden evening the following summer, they sat together in Boston Common, the oldest park in the city. The grass was warm beneath them, and the air hummed with the sounds of children playing. Sophia, now a sturdy toddler with dark curls and bright eyes, ran across the grass chasing bubbles another child had released. Her laughter carried on the breeze, bright and unbroken. Victoria leaned back against a bench, her shoulders finally relaxed. Gabriel sat beside her, a medical journal resting forgotten on his lap as his eyes followed Sophia's every move. "She's fearless," he said with quiet pride. Victoria smiled. "She gets that from you." He chuckled. "I'm not so sure." For a long while they sat in silence, watching Sophia tumble into the grass, pick herself up and run again. Around them, Boston moved as it always had. Tourists snapping photos, joggers weaving through paths, the skyline glowing in the evening sun. But for Victoria, the world had slowed to this moment. Her daughter's laughter, Gabriel's steady presence, the peace she never thought she would find. As the sun dipped lower, painting the park in amber light, Victoria felt the swell of realization. The life she once clung to, the marriage, the salon, the image of perfection, was gone. In its place was something quieter but infinitely stronger. She glanced at Gabriel, then back at Sophia, and the truth formed in her heart with clarity. Family isn't about blood. It's about choice. It was about choosing to stay when things were difficult, choosing to protect rather than to wound, choosing to love without conditions. Victoria reached for Gabriel's hand. He didn't look at her, not immediately, but his fingers closed around hers, strong and certain. Together, they watched Sophia chase the last of the bubbles across the grass, her laughter ringing out like a promise. And for the first time in years, Victoria felt whole. The words sliced through me sharper than any blade. Your presence would bring down the caliber of attendees. I stood frozen, gripping the polished brass handle of Preston Hawthorne's office door, my knuckles whitening as if I could squeeze the humiliation out of existence. Preston, reclining comfortably in his Italian leather chair, steepled his fingers and wore that smug, insincere expression I'd come to know far too well. The corner of his mouth twitched upward in false sympathy as his cold gaze traveled from my sensible navy blazer to the practical black pumps I'd worn countless times before. "I just don't believe your executive material, Audrey," he continued smoothly, just loud enough for the surrounding cubicles to catch every word. "The Caldwell Cove Private Resort is extremely exclusive. Our clients expect a certain level of polish and sophistication." His eyes lingered disapprovingly on my modest jewelry and conservative appearance. "You understand, of course." I forced my breathing to remain steady even though my heartbeat thundered in my ears. I could feel the shift in energy across the open plan office behind me. The tapping of keyboards had slowed. Conversations had abruptly stopped mid-sentence. I knew they were listening. I always knew. The invisible wall had just become concrete. "I understand," I said evenly, my voice betraying none of the raw fury surging through me. I stood straighter, keeping the steel of my dignity intact. "Thank you for the clarification." I walked away, back through the labyrinth of glass partitions and hushed whispers, chin held high as my father had taught me long ago. Never let them see you break. Never let them taste blood. The moment I reached my desk, my trembling fingers slowly unclenched. The soft click of my chair felt unnaturally loud in the silence that followed. I stared blankly at the open Apex Technologies project file on my screen. I had landed that account. I had delivered every milestone early. I had outperformed every single metric. And still, Preston had deemed me unworthy. The irony was suffocating. I knew that resort better than any of them could ever dream. I knew the polished teak floors, the delicate hand-woven fabrics, the private meditation pavilion that had been my own design concept during college. I had practically grown up at Caldwell Cove, folding towels beside the staff at 7 years old, learning how to set an elegant dinner table at 10, watching my father build his empire brick by brick. Yet I had chosen this. I had chosen to work under Preston's thumb at Brighton and Company, marketing group, rejecting my family name and fortune to prove myself on merit alone. And now this man, this mediocre fraud wrapped in overpriced tailoring, had told me I didn't belong at my own family's legacy. My phone sat quietly on my desk. I stared at it for a long, bitter moment. The urge to smash it into pieces was overwhelming. Instead, I reached for it with deliberate calm. My thumb hovered over the contact, labeled simply Dad. I hadn't called him in months. I had sworn I wouldn't, but this time was different. I took a slow breath and dialed. The line rang twice. His deep, familiar voice answered casually, "Audrey." I clenched my jaw to keep the emotion from cracking through. "Hi, Dad," I exhaled slowly. "We need to talk about the company retreat at Caldwell Cove next week. I have a favor to ask." There was a pause. I imagined him pacing the terrace of our private estate, the sound of waves crashing against the shore behind him. "Interesting timing," he said finally, a sharp edge of curiosity cutting into his tone. "Let's talk." I smiled faintly for the first time that day. I had just made my decision. 3 years earlier, when I first walked into Brighton and Company as just another applicant with an MBA and an iron determination, I had been nobody, and I wanted it that way. My father, Harrison Caldwell, had stood on the marble steps of our family estate that morning, confusion softening his usually steely expression. "You know you don't have to do this, Audrey," he had said quietly as I loaded 2 battered suitcases into my aging Honda Civic. "You have a place at Caldwell Hospitality, a vice president title tomorrow if you want it." I had smiled and shaken my head, gripping the car door. "I have to know I earned it, Dad. I have to know who's real and who's not." He had nodded slowly, pride flickering behind his concern. "Then go build your own path." And so I had. My apartment, a modest 1-bedroom unit, tucked into the unglamorous outskirts of Newport Beach, smelled faintly of old wood and ocean air. My car had more dents than shine. My work wardrobe consisted of carefully chosen basics: tailored slacks, crisp white shirts, low-heeled pumps. No designer logos, no extravagant jewelry, just function. It wasn't hardship. It was freedom. But Preston Hawthorne hadn't seen it that way. The moment I stepped into Brighton and Company, I could feel his gaze. Calculating. Dismissive. I wasn't flashy enough. I didn't wear the right labels, didn't frequent expensive restaurants where deals were accidentally brokered over dry martinis. To Preston, I was safe to ignore, safe to exploit. The first year, I worked tirelessly, staying long past midnight, volunteering for every project no one else wanted. My reward? Being passed over for promotions I had clearly earned. Preston had a talent for subtle sabotage. My name conveniently forgotten on presentations. My strategy proposals reassigned at the last minute to junior male colleagues from his inner circle. I still remember the sting of watching Tyler and Jason deliver my fully built pitch deck to the Mitchell Sports drink team, barely even understanding the key talking points. I had sat there in the back row of the conference room, expression neutral, heart quietly fracturing. Every coincidence chipped away at my patience. Every offhand comment about my basic style or lack of executive polish was like sandpaper on raw skin. But I endured. Not for them. For me. I know who I am, I whispered to myself one night at 2 a.m., staring at my reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror of my tiny apartment. They don't get to define my worth. By the second year, I started winning clients despite Preston's best efforts to box me into low-profile accounts. The Apex Technologies campaign had been my breakthrough. I had crafted a groundbreaking digital transformation proposal, integrating predictive AI with traditional marketing models. It had impressed the client so much that they requested I personally lead the account, a first for someone at my level. Preston's reaction had been swift and predictable. "You'll need support," he had said with that fake smile of his. "I'm assigning Tyler and Jason to co-manage it. Big accounts require big teamwork." It wasn't support. It was insurance. Split the credit if it succeeded. Assign blame to me if it failed. Still, I delivered. The internal email from Margot Evans, the new VP of Client Relations, had been the first real validation I had received in months. "Can you drop by at 4? I want to discuss your thinking on Apex." Brilliant work. Emmy. For 30 golden minutes in her office, we had discussed real ideas without politics, without posturing. I had walked back to my desk that day feeling something dangerous, hope, but it hadn't lasted long. Preston noticed instantly. His eyes had narrowed as Margot praised my insights. His grip on his empire and on me had slipped ever so slightly. I had known then, even as I sat typing follow-up notes, that the backlash would be brutal. I wasn't wrong. When the company-wide email about the upcoming executive retreat at Caldwell Cove landed in my inbox 2 weeks later, my name was missing. Omitted despite my role leading the highest profile account Brighton and Company had landed that quarter. That omission had been deliberate. And now, 3 years after I first walked through those glass doors, it had all come full circle. I stared out at the late afternoon haze beyond my office window, the horizon blurring into soft gold. "Enough," I whispered. It was time to stop hiding. Time to remind Preston Hawthorne and the world exactly whose name was carved into the foundation stone of Caldwell Cove Private Resort. The apartment felt smaller than usual that night, as though the walls had shifted, closing in around me with the weight of humiliation. I kicked off my plain black pumps and let them tumble noisily to the floor. My uninspired navy blazer followed, draped unceremoniously over the back of a worn dining chair. The same chair I had bought secondhand during graduate school. I poured myself 2 fingers of the 30-year-old Macallan my father had given me last Christmas, the one luxury I allowed myself in private. The amber liquid burned smoothly down my throat, chasing away the bitter taste of Preston's words. The apartment was silent except for the distant sound of traffic and the rhythmic crash of waves from the nearby shoreline. I stared out the window toward the Pacific, a horizon I had once dreamed represented endless opportunity. Tonight it mocked me. The clock on the wall read 9:31 p.m. My phone lay untouched on the kitchen counter, screen dark. I hadn't called my father in months, determined to maintain distance, to prove that I could do this on my own, without his shadow looming over my choices. I stared at it, the internal war raging. Finally, I picked it up with deliberate calm, scrolled to the contact labeled Dad. My thumb hovered for only a moment before I pressed call. 2 rings. Audrey. His voice was warm, familiar, with that unmistakable edge of control and calculation that had built an empire from nothing. I swallowed hard. My words came out quieter than I intended. Hi, Dad. I hesitated, suddenly unsure. We need to talk about the company retreat at Caldwell Cove next week. I have a favor to ask. There was a long pause. I imagined him standing on the terrace of our family's estate, dark suit jacket over one shoulder, staring out at the same vast ocean I now faced alone. The soft crash of waves echoed faintly through the line. Interesting timing, he said at last, his tone shifting from casual to sharp. You've avoided mixing work and family for 3 years. What changed? I closed my eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply before I answered. I've tried to do this my way, on my terms. I still want that, but I've been pushed too far. Another pause. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. I see. His voice softened slightly. What do you need? I smiled, faintly despite myself. The presidential villa, and Carlos needs to know I'm coming. But I don't want you to interfere directly. No phone calls. No warnings. Let me handle the reveal my way. There was silence again, then a deep, satisfied chuckle. The presidential villa? You always did have impeccable taste. That's a $25,000 per night booking, you know. Precisely. I heard the rustle of papers, the clicking of a keyboard on his end. You realize you could have had this company at 25, Audrey. I offered. I know. And yet here we are, he sighed heavily. Fine. Carlos will prepare everything to your specifications. You have my word. Relief washed over me. Thank you, Dad. His voice warmed again with quiet pride. You're finally playing to win, sweetheart. About time. Call me after your all-hands meeting tomorrow. We'll finalize the arrangements. Will do. I ended the call and stared out at the dark ocean once more, the weight in my chest lightening for the first time all day. The familiar rhythm of waves calmed me. This wasn't about revenge for the sake of ego. It was about restoring my dignity on my terms at my family's resort. I drained the last sip of whiskey and whispered to the empty room, "Let the games begin." Tuesday morning greeted me with cruel precision. I was seated at my desk by 7:30 a.m., an hour before most of my colleagues even began drifting in. The building's tall windows framed the Newport Beach skyline under a pale, washed-out sky. At exactly 7:55 a.m., my phone vibrated across the desk. A simple text from Dad, jet-fueled and waiting. Presidential villa confirmed. Carlos sends his regards. I smiled slightly, allowing myself the smallest moment of satisfaction. But the day ahead belonged to the farce I had lived for 3 years, the carefully choreographed circus of Brighton and Company. By 9:30 a.m., the office buzzed with the usual caffeine-fueled urgency. I spotted Preston in his usual stance at the center of the open floor, surrounded by Tyler, Jason, and the rest of his chosen circle. His voice carried easily across the partitioned space. Snorkeling first or sailing? Preston mused dramatically, waving a glossy travel brochure from Caldwell Cove Resort. Maybe I'll do both. Tough life. He paused deliberately as I walked past. Oh, wait. Audrey, you won't be there to worry about it. The snickers from the group were soft, but unmistakable. I kept walking, Chin lifted, steps measured. My email inbox exploded by midday. The subject lines read like weapons. Urgent. Henderson campaign alternate concepts needed by Friday. Wilson holiday campaign. Request for early draft FWD. Additional edits to Mitchell presentation deck for additional projects. All with conflicting deadlines. All due just after the retreat ended. The intent was transparent. Preston was burying me in busy work to ensure I stayed behind, silent and overworked. I opened each file methodically, fingers calm even as anger simmered beneath the surface. My father had taught me long ago, never let emotion dictate your strategy. Never react until the moment to strike arrived. The only disappointment came from Margot. After weeks of professional camaraderie, she had begun to distance herself in subtle ways. I had caught her twice turning down side corridors to avoid passing me. She stopped replying directly to my emails. In meetings, she addressed her comments to others, even when responding to my suggestions. Finally, Thursday afternoon, I knocked on her office door, Apex project file in hand. "Not a good time, Audrey," she said briskly without looking up from her computer screen. "Send me an email." I hesitated, only briefly. "I thought you wanted to be directly involved in the Apex account." She finally looked up, expression unreadable. "Priorities have shifted. Preston feels the account needs more executive oversight." I absorbed the blow, quietly. The message was clear. Aligning herself with the excluded employee offered no upward benefit. Margot had chosen survival over integrity. I nodded once. "I see." I walked back to my desk under the cold fluorescent lights. No one met my eyes as I passed. The invisible wall had returned, thicker than ever. I stared out the window at the slow-rolling fog over the Pacific. The pieces were all moving exactly as I had predicted. At 5:42 p.m., I received the final text I had been waiting for. "Antonio, all preparations complete. Staff briefed. Looking forward to your arrival. Revenge is best served with ocean views." I allowed myself one deep breath. The trap was set. They had written the script, but I was about to change the ending. I closed my laptop, rose from my chair, and whispered to the empty office, "Tomorrow." Friday evening passed in a blur of quiet preparation. My suitcase stood by the door, not the battered black roller I normally traveled with, but a discreet, beautifully crafted leather set that had belonged to my mother. Simple, timeless, perfect. The soft chime of an encrypted email interrupted my thoughts. Attached were dozens of high-resolution photographs of the recently renovated presidential villa at Caldwell Cove, a project I had personally contributed design input to during my final year at Stanford. I stared at the images, absorbing every detail. The soaring floor-to-ceiling windows, the infinity pool melting into the ocean horizon, the signature blend of indigenous woodwork and cutting-edge architecture. Every detail had been arranged exactly as I envisioned, not for comfort, but for theater. At 6:15 a.m. on Saturday, I arrived at the private executive airstrip just outside Los Angeles. The sleek silhouette of the Caldwell jet gleamed under the early morning sun. A familiar figure waited at the bottom of the stairs. "Welcome aboard, Miss Caldwell." Diane greeted me warmly. Diane had been with our family for over 15 years. Her professional smile softened as I approached. "It's wonderful to see you again." I smiled genuinely. "Thank you, Diane. How's your daughter doing at UCLA?" Her face brightened. "Thriving. I can't believe you remembered." Of course I did. Tell her I'm proud of her. As I settled into the wide leather seat, I felt something I hadn't known in years. Anticipation without dread. For once, I wasn't shrinking to fit someone else's expectations. The 3-hour flight passed peacefully. Instead of my usual business uniform, I wore a simple white linen shift dress paired with understated gold sandals and my mother's sapphire pendant, the exact shade of Caldwell Cove's signature blue. elegant but not flashy, unmistakably belonging. The jet touched down smoothly on the island's private landing strip at exactly 10:02 a.m. The Caribbean sun was already high, casting sharp shadows across the manicured grounds. Antonio Ramirez stood waiting at the bottom of the steps, arms crossed, wearing his customary tailored resort whites. His broad smile broke into genuine warmth as I descended. "Little Audrey Caldwell," he said fondly, before stepping back and offering me his arm. "Though you are not so little anymore. Your father tells me you've become quite the marketing genius." I laughed softly. Hardly a genius, just underestimated a powerful combination. He led me toward the waiting golf cart. "Tell me exactly how you want this to unfold." I handed him a folded photo of Preston. "This man is the one to watch. I want it subtle, Antonio. No drama. No one loses a job. This isn't about destruction. It's about recalibration." Antonio nodded, a mischievous sparkle dancing in his eyes. "Understood. Though your father sounded quite disappointed when I explained he couldn't have this Preston accidentally lose his luggage in the ocean." We shared a knowing laugh. By 1:30 p.m., I was in place, concealed just behind the extravagant native floral arrangement in the grand lobby. I had the perfect sight line of the entrance. Carlos, always the professional, stood at the reception desk calmly reviewing the arrival documents. At precisely 2:07 p.m., the double-glass doors swung open. The Brighton and Company entourage streamed inside. Sun hats, sunglasses, and loud laughter filled the air as they gazed around, visibly awestruck by the soaring wooden beams and panoramic ocean views. Preston strutted forward like a man stepping onto a personal stage, expensive tropical shirt still creased from its packaging. He turned, dramatically addressing the group. "This, ladies and gentlemen, is what true luxury looks like," he announced grandly. From behind the foliage, I couldn't help but smile. Preston had no idea, but the stage was no longer his. Tomorrow would belong to me. The lobby fell into an expectant hush as Antonio stepped forward, clipboard in hand, cutting an impressive figure of calm authority. "Welcome to Caldwell Cove Private Resort," he announced warmly. "I am Antonio Ramirez, General Manager. We're delighted to have Brighton and Company Marketing Group as our guests." Preston surged ahead, confidently, extending his hand. "Preston Hawthorne, President of Brighton and Company. I believe my assistant confirmed our arrangements for the executive ocean villas." Antonio accepted the handshake with polite indifference. "Indeed, Mr. Hawthorne. However, there has been a change." Preston blinked, his confident facade cracking ever so slightly. "A change?" Antonio scanned the room dramatically, eyes passing over every stunned face before resting on me. "If you'll excuse me, I must first greet our primary guest, Miss Caldwell." I stepped slowly from behind the lush floral arrangement. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if time itself held its breath. Preston's eyes widened, his jaw slackening as recognition dawned painfully. His skin drained of color, leaving him ghostly pale against his freshly tanned face. I walked forward, calm, composed, my white linen dress fluttering softly with each step. The sapphire pendant at my throat caught the sunlight and refracted it like a tiny flame. Antonio smiled broadly as he embraced me. "Welcome home, Miss Caldwell. Your father called personally to ensure everything was prepared to your exact specifications." The silence that followed was absolute. The stunned expressions around the room were deliciously familiar. The same colleagues who had avoided my gaze all week now scrambled to process what they were witnessing. The woman they had dismissed as basic and unworthy was the daughter of Harrison Caldwell, the man whose name adorned every wall and whose legacy built this empire. "Thank you, Antonio," I replied, my voice clear and even. "It's wonderful to be home." Preston stumbled backward, colliding clumsily with the polished reception desk. A staff member instinctively reached out to steady him as he gripped the marble edge for balance. You're Caldwell, he whispered hoarsely. I turned to him with the faintest smile, every inch of me the poised executive he had refused to acknowledge for 3 years. Hello, Preston. Surprise. I let the word hang in the charged air. The other Brighton team members stood frozen in disbelief, unsure whether to move, speak, or simply vanish. Antonio, consummate professional as always, continued without missing a beat. Everyone, please follow me to the presidential villa that Miss Caldwell has graciously reserved for your company's exclusive use. Gasps rippled through the group. Murmurs erupted like a slow wave. The presidential villa. Margot finally managed to speak, her voice cracking slightly. Yes, Antonio confirmed. Our crown jewel, $25,000 per night. Though, of course, there is no charge for Miss Caldwell or her guests. As the team filed toward the waiting fleet of luxury golf carts, I fell into step beside Preston, who walked as if in a daze, shoulders hunched inward as though trying to make himself invisible. I lowered my voice, so only he could hear. Don't worry, Preston. I wouldn't dream of bringing down the caliber of attendees. After all, this is what true luxury looks like. The look on his face, shock, disbelief, and finally the bitter sting of humiliation, was worth every agonizing slight I had endured. The procession out of the grand lobby felt surreal. Antonio and I walked effortlessly ahead while the Brighton team trailed behind, wide-eyed and whispering. I caught Jason tripping over his own feet, too distracted by staring at me to watch where he was walking. Tyler leaned urgently toward Margot, whispering furiously, as if trying to make sense of the impossible. Preston shuffled along behind them, breathing heavy, reduced to a shadow of the man who had once controlled my career so casually. We emerged into the golden afternoon light. The golf carts stood ready, spotless and gleaming like sentinels awaiting their riders. Your cart is up front with me, Miss Caldwell, Antonio offered smoothly, gesturing to the lead vehicle. I slid gracefully into the passenger seat. Preston instinctively moved forward, then froze mid-step as realization hit. The invitation had not been for him. He retreated awkwardly, head bowed, as Antonio guided me forward. As the convoy wound through the manicured tropical landscape, past private groves and hidden beaches, I sat back against the cool leather seat and allowed myself the smallest smile of satisfaction. For the first time in 3 years, I was exactly where I belonged. The convoy of golf carts curved gracefully along the winding coastal road, each bend revealing glimpses of aquamarine waves crashing gently against white sand coves. I knew every palm tree, every flowering hibiscus, every carved stone that marked the path. I had helped plan this resort as a teenager. They were walking through my legacy, even if they didn't know it yet. As we approached the presidential villa, the structure emerged like a vision from a dream. Perched dramatically along the cliffside, 3 sides of the villa opened to endless ocean views. 6 separate bedroom suites, an infinity pool that spilled into the horizon, and private terraces with handcrafted furniture awaited them. The Brighton staff gasped audibly as the carts came to a halt. Phones appeared instantly to capture every perfect angle. Welcome to your home for the next 4 days, Antonio announced proudly. The villa doors swung open to reveal the grand interior. Soaring ceilings of native wood, curated museum-quality art pieces, and expansive living areas bathed in golden sunlight. I turned to Antonio and spoke with quiet assurance. Would you mind if I handle the room assignments? He smiled knowingly and handed me the villa's sleek tablet. Of course, Miss Caldwell. I tapped through the list with the deliberate calm of someone who had waited a very long time for this moment. Let's see, I said lightly, knowing full well that every pair of eyes had shifted from the artwork to me. Julia and Lisa, you'll have the Ocean Master Suites. Their eyes widened. Those were the 2 finest rooms, typically reserved for royalty and heads of state. They looked around uncertainly, confused as to why I was elevating them above their senior colleagues. They didn't realize I had chosen them for their simple human kindness over the years. They had never joined the office whispers, never participated in the quiet exclusion. Tyler and Jason, you'll be in the coral suites with private plunge pools. I watched their smug relief as they exchanged approving glances. They had no idea I had just assigned them to rooms furthest from the main villa, a deliberate subtlety in the hierarchy of luxury. I worked my way methodically down the list, bypassing certain department heads who had once rolled their eyes when I entered meetings. Those who had treated me with indifference were assigned to comfortable but modest suites tucked near the garden walls. Finally, only Preston remained. He shifted uncomfortably under my gaze. "And Preston," I paused, savoring the heavy silence, "you'll be in the garden suite." A few of the Brighton team glanced sideways in confusion. They didn't know the garden suite was never designed for executives. It had been intended for accompanying staff. It lacked an ocean view. Its terrace faced the service road behind the villa. Even the linens were simpler. Preston opened his mouth as if to protest, but no words came out. His eyes flickered between me and Antonio, then back to the tablet I still held. He swallowed hard and gave a stiff nod. "Of course. Staff will show you to your accommodations," I said smoothly, closing the tablet and handing it back to Antonio. "Please take time to relax. We'll gather for welcome cocktails on the main terrace at sunset, followed by dinner at 8. The group dispersed hesitantly, many still stealing sidelong glances at me, trying to reconcile the person they had underestimated for so long with the woman who now held absolute control over their experience. As Preston trudged toward the path leading to his modest suite, I walked beside him one final time. He kept his gaze fixed on the ground. I leaned in just enough for only him to hear. "You always said I lacked the polish and sophistication to represent Brighton and Company in a luxury setting." I paused, letting the sound of the ocean fill the space between us. "How's this for polish, Preston?" The faintest flush of red crept up his neck, the only admission of defeat I would ever get. I didn't need more. His humiliation was complete. I turned away and walked confidently back toward the grand villa, the sea breeze lifting the hem of my linen dress as if even the island itself had acknowledged my rightful place, and the best was still to come. The morning sun rose over Caldwell Cove like liquid gold spilling across the waves. I stood barefoot on the polished teak balcony outside my suite, watching pelicans drift lazily above the surf. The faint sound of laughter echoed from the far side of the property as Brighton and Company staff began to explore the grounds. I sipped my coffee slowly, savoring the calm before the next act. At exactly 8 a.m., I heard the unmistakable sound of Antonio's soft knock. "Miss Caldwell," he murmured through the door. "We have an unexpected visitor." I frowned slightly and stepped inside, pulling a lightweight silk wrap over my shoulders. When I emerged into the villa's grand living room, I froze. Standing near the entrance, surveying the space with quiet authority, was Harrison Caldwell, my father. At 62, he remained an imposing figure, tall, sharply tailored, his silver hair glinting like steel under the soft morning light. His piercing blue eyes flicked over the intricate details of the room with practiced efficiency before settling on me with a warmth reserved only for family. "Good morning, sweetheart," he greeted, pulling me into a quick but firm embrace. I know I promised to stay away, but he smiled slightly. I couldn't resist seeing how Brighton and Company is enjoying our humble accommodations. I laughed under my breath at his casual understatement. "I told you I had it handled." "I can see that." His eyes twinkled as they took in the luxurious surroundings. "You've staged this perfectly." At that moment, voices drifted from outside. The Brighton team had gathered for the scheduled breakfast buffet on the beachside terrace. My father straightened, smoothed the lapel of his linen blazer, and gave me a sly glance. "Shall we?" We stepped out together onto the terrace. Conversations stopped abruptly. Forks clinked awkwardly against plates. The air changed instantly, like static before a summer storm. Recognition dawned slowly. Harrison Caldwell rarely appeared publicly, preferring anonymity behind his empire. But no photograph could fully capture the sheer command of his presence in person. I watched as colleagues stiffened visibly, their gazes darting between me and him, the realization spreading like wildfire. Preston froze mid-bite, his color draining to a sickly shade of gray. He hastily wiped his mouth, then stood clumsily, extending a hand with a forced smile. Mr. Caldwell, sir, what an unexpected pleasure! My father shook his hand briefly, his own smile thin, not quite reaching his eyes. Fascinating property you have here, Mr. Hawthorne. Preston chuckled nervously. Why, yes, it's truly spectacular. We've been extremely impressed with the attention to detail. Dad's gaze flicked to me, then back to Preston. Though I must apologize for our communication system. I was told the villa's microphones are surprisingly sensitive. Picked up some interesting conversations yesterday. Something about caliber of attendees. Preston blinked. His mouth opened and closed twice, but no sound emerged. A thin sheen of sweat began to form at his temples. I kept my expression carefully neutral, even as I fought the urge to smile. My father was bluffing. Our privacy protocols were ironclad. But Preston didn't know that, and terror flickered unmistakably behind his eyes. Dad turned away smoothly, as if bored already. Well, I'm intruding. Please enjoy your breakfast. He squeezed my shoulder affectionately as he walked back toward the villa. You're running this show, Audrey. I'm just here for the view. As I sat down at the long communal table, I could feel the shift. Where only yesterday I had been the invisible outsider, suddenly chairs were being pulled back for me. Voices softened deferentially as they addressed me directly. Even the most oblivious of my colleagues could no longer deny the truth. Preston, meanwhile, sat rigidly at the far end of the table, barely able to meet anyone's eyes, a hollow shell of the man who had once wielded absolute control. The sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky, casting shimmering reflections across the infinity pool and the glass windows behind us. And I knew, deep in my bones, that the best part of my performance was still to come. The heat of the afternoon sun softened into warm amber as I stood on the quiet stretch of private beach that curved like a crescent beneath the cliffs. Waves rolled in lazily, brushing against the pale sand and retreating with soft whispers. I waited, folder in hand. In the distance, I spotted Preston, standing stiffly at the water's edge, shoulders hunched, eyes staring blankly at the endless horizon. His entire body language screamed defeat. I approached silently, the fine sand shifting under my bare feet. Only when I stood a few feet away did he seem to register my presence. He turned slowly, face pale and drawn, lips pressed into a hard line. Beautiful view, I said softly, joining him to stare at the water. He flinched at the sound of my voice. Yes, he murmured. Beautiful. I extended the folder toward him without ceremony. I believe you should review these. Confused, he took the file and opened it hesitantly. His eyes scanned the neatly organized documentation. Emails, meeting notes, timelines, presentation decks with mysteriously missing credits. Page after page of subtle undermining, reassignments, exclusion tactics, and comments thinly veiled as professional feedback. I watched the color drain from his face with each passing page. His hands began to tremble. I could present this to the board, I said evenly, or file a formal complaint with HR. Both would be devastating for you, and frankly, completely justified. He snapped the folder shut and clutched it tightly against his chest as if it were a grenade. You're going to destroy me, he whispered, his voice raw. No, I shook my head slowly. That was never my intention. He stared at me in disbelief. Then why? Because revenge, as satisfying as it might be in the moment, doesn't build anything lasting. I'm offering you something else, a chance at redemption." His brow furrowed, cautiously hopeful, but clearly not trusting what he was hearing. What do you mean?" I took a slow breath, choosing my words carefully. "You will step down from Brighton and Company, quietly, voluntarily. You will recommend a full restructuring of our internal advancement policies. You will support a merit-based promotion system and participate in mandatory leadership training focused on bias and ethics." His eyes widened slightly. "And if I refuse?" I let the question hang ominously in the air as the breeze stirred my hair. "Then the board sees the file, and you won't walk away from this with any dignity left intact." The silence stretched between us, punctuated only by the rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks. Finally, he let out a shuddering breath and nodded, shoulders sagging under the weight of resignation. "Why?" he asked again, softer this time. "After everything I did to you, why offer me a way out?" I smiled faintly, gazing out at the line where the sky kissed the sea. "Because I want change, Preston. Not just for me, but for every person coming up behind me who deserves better. You've been given a second chance to be part of that change. Don't waste it." He stared at me for a long moment, the full depth of what I had said settling over him. Slowly he nodded again. "I'll do it." I offered no handshake, no final word of encouragement. I simply turned and walked back along the beach, the setting sun casting long shadows behind me. Back at the villa, as twilight settled in and soft lantern light illuminated the terrace for our final evening dinner, I looked around the long table at the Brighton team. The conversations were easy, the laughter genuine. For the first time, I belonged without having to shrink myself, without hiding who I was. The true power of this moment wasn't in what I had taken from Preston. It was in what I had reclaimed for myself. The soft glow of torches cast dancing shadows across the white sand as our final dinner unfolded under the stars. Tables were set directly on the beach, linen cloths billowing gently in the breeze. Distant waves played their soothing rhythm as the moon climbed steadily above the horizon. The Brighton team had relaxed noticeably over the past days. The stiff corporate postures had softened into real conversations. Junior staff, once hesitant to speak, now shared ideas openly. Even Tyler and Jason had shown flashes of unexpected humility. I rose slowly from my seat at the head of the table. The soft murmur of conversation fell silent almost instantly. Dozens of expectant faces turned toward me. I took a long breath, my toes sinking slightly into the warm sand, and began. 3 years ago, I walked through the doors of Brighton and Company determined to prove that I could succeed based solely on my work, not my family's name. My gaze swept the crowd. I lived in a small apartment. I drove an aging car. I wore simple clothes. I chose to stand in the shadows because I believed merit would speak for itself. Several people shifted uncomfortably. I continued. What I learned instead is that privilege operates in subtle ways, that the game is often rigged before you ever sit at the table. I had a safety net, whether I admitted it or not, but many people never do. The table was utterly silent. Only the sound of distant waves answered me for a beat. "Change starts when we stop playing by broken rules," I said quietly. "Effective immediately, Brighton and Company will be implementing new policies to ensure equal opportunities for advancement. Leadership decisions will be made based on merit, not politics or favoritism. We will partner with the newly formed Caldwell Foundation for Business Equity to provide paid internships and mentorship for students who have talent but lack connections." I paused to let the words settle. Then, slowly, applause began. It started with Lisa and Julia at my right, then spread around the table like a ripple across calm water. Some faces showed genuine support. Others clapped because they knew the power dynamic had shifted. Either way, the message had been delivered. 6 months later, I sat in the same office that had once belonged to Preston Hawthorne. The nameplate on the door now read Audrey Caldwell, President and CEO. The sun streamed warmly through the tall glass windows. My office remained simple. Clean lines, no status symbols, no unnecessary extravagance. My clothes were still classic and functional, not because I had to hide anymore, but because I could now choose it as a declaration of who I was. On my desk sat a single piece of coral in a glass display case, a gift from the conservation team we had visited during the retreat. It was a quiet reminder that even fragile things could rebuild and flourish when given the chance. Beside it stood a framed photograph taken just 2 weeks earlier. Me and my father standing proudly with the first class of interns sponsored by the Caldwell Foundation. Young faces, diverse, brilliant, hungry for opportunity, smiled into the camera. The intercom on my desk buzzed gently. My assistant's voice came through. Your father is on line 1. Something about next year's company retreat. I smiled warmly. Some things had changed dramatically, others not at all. I lifted the receiver and leaned back in my chair, staring out over the same Pacific horizon that had once mocked me and now welcomed me home. Hi, Dad, I said softly. I was just thinking about you.